a recent study says that pastor salaries haven't increased since 2018. We're talking about that today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, this article caught my attention a week or two ago on the Facebook, the title of which is SBC Pastor Pay Stuck at Same Level Since 2018. And, at first blush, you might think, well, that's just the Baptists. But my experience has been that largely what you see in one group, you're seeing in another. There might be some outliers, some denominations or types of churches that are doing a better job. But if pastors are being underpaid in the SBC, they're probably being underpaid other places as well. So I think what we'd like to do today is first just sort of hit the highlights of this study that was done, but then kind of talk about what should be happening as it relates to pastor salaries and the kinds of raises that churches should be exploring. So, AJ, what jumped out to you the most in looking at this article?
Yeah, well, a lot has even happened in 2022. So I know this article just came out, but I don't know when they actually cut off the research, if it was at the end of 21 or, the first part of 2022. So, it says in here the consumer price index has jumped 17.6% from 2018 to 2022, kind of setting up the fact that prices of things have gone up since 2018 significantly. And I'm thinking, gosh, is that even true? Here we're putting this out in September 2022. Is that where the consumer price index actually is today? Because everything costs more, even in the last 60 to 90 days. So maybe this is even worse. I haven't heard. I haven't heard, of a rash of pastor salary increases over the summer of 2022. So the premise of this being that things cost a lot more, salaries haven't increased, and it's probably worse today than it was 6 months ago because it's hitting us all that way, right? Yeah, but salaries haven't necessarily increased at the Malphurs Group since 2018 either. So we know that things cost more.
Yeah, when we're done with this podcast, AJ, you and I have a conversation we need to have. No, I'm just kidding. So just actually, there is an answer to this. We have the salary study was between April 1st and June 30th, 2022.
Oh, okay. All right. So it's pretty close then. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it caught a lot of the uptick there. But the thing that jumped out to me, AJ, is not just that the consumer price index has jumped 17.6%, but that's compared with the average increase in salary and housing is just 0.2%. And in when their whole pay package actually in this time period fell 2.1% when you lump in retirement and insurance benefits and things like that. So that's not good. You have the same or less money trying to make ends meet when things have gone up, approaching 20% over the last 4 years. And that is not sustainable for pastors.
Yeah. And we had a global pandemic here the last 2 years of that the study covers. Few people got raises during that time, but the 2 years prior to that, probably things were going okay and would have been possible.
Right. So, but the study also mentions how 1 in 5 pastors mentions that one of their chief concerns every day, the things that are kind of keeping them up at night, is financial stress. And so I think this is even just a good segue even into talking about how we should be thinking about pastor pay in church. Listen, if you're a pastor and you're stressed out about, can I make ends meet? And it's not because you've been irresponsible. It's not like you've gone out and you've bought a car you can't afford and a house you can't afford and all of these things. If you're just trying to make ends meet and do things the right way, and you're really struggling, that's going to impact your ability to lead and to shepherd and to preach and to do all the things that, in theory at least, your church has asked you to do and commissioned you to do and called you to do. And so they're getting a lesser version of you if you're stressed out about
Yeah.
trying to make things work.
I think we're probably really the biggest thing that jumped out at me is a little bit further down in the article, the fact that this is only like the senior pastor salaries that have been this bad. Other staff pastors and I think other staff positions have seen significantly larger increases compared to 0.2%. Other full-time staff ministers, it says, have seen both compensation and pay package increases since 2018, more to the tune of 7.5%. So this, to me, this ends up being less about the fact that maybe churches are strapped and no one's getting paid, to keep up with inflation, as to why are senior pastors perhaps being singled out. I don't know what the perspective is, that says
But
that's.
I do feel like, AJ, what you're saying needs a little bit of context. Okay, so some other staff pastors are getting a raise of 7%. That's still a 10% gap
Yeah. Oh,
between
yeah.
between their pay and the cost of things. So you're saying it's just a little bit less bad. And I want to defend churches here a little bit. A senior pastor's salary was already larger. So you have, I'll just speak for myself. Okay. When I started out in ministry, my first full-time ministry job, I had a few part-time jobs, and, you don't expect to get paid much, and you aren't. But my first full-time ministry job started in 2006 or 2007, somewhere around there. And they paid me $28,000. Okay. That, the senior pastor was making six figures at this church. So yeah, maybe they're only giving him a 0.2% raise, and they should have probably given me like a 60% raise to get me competitive with what I was doing. And so those numbers then look really bad. You go, oh, this guy got a 7% raise and the pastor only got a 0.2% raise. Well, if you're starting from 28,000, you need a lot more help to make ends meet than if you're starting from $65,000 or $70,000. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
I'm trying to defend the churches a little bit, why they may have prioritized some other staff people when it came to raises versus the
Only
pastor.
if they're underpaid compared to the quote unquote market, comparable to similar positions in other churches, to me is one of the primary factors that would be looked at. The end goal is not that the interns make as much as the senior pastor. So we're going to give him 0.2 every year,
Sure.
and they're going to get 32% until everybody makes the exact same salary. Obviously, that's not the goal. So if low paid positions are grossly underpaid, low pay is different than underpay.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
I would contend that you have a lot of folks who are in ministry who, just about everyone in ministry is underpaid. And then especially in a sort of average sized church, large churches, a lot of those guys make pretty good money. But in sort of a normative size church, pretty much everyone's getting underpaid. And then when you start talking about some of those positions that are going to get paid less anyway, I mean, I'm not arguing that the youth pastor should make as much money as the senior pastor. I am saying lots of times those youth pastors are getting just totally raked over the coals. And then they expect, why is your wife having to work? Well, you try to make it work. You try to work 60 hours a week for $28,000.
No doubt.
And
we're talking about the overwhelming majority of churches in the United States are are small to medium sized churches that don't have the budgets to be paying those large salaries. So this covers most of probably our audience for sure, and most people that are in ministry. You didn't get into it to get rich, but you certainly would like to be compensated so that your family is at least has some financial security in keeping a roof over your head and food on the table, and not having, going back to what's mentioned here, of having worries about finance, and which kind of drives more to the point that I think we want to talk about is we should, as members and leaders in churches, we should work towards our pastoral staff people not having financial worries that would affect their job. It's not a marketplace job; it's a ministry, and we'll get into our belief based on Scripture is that they are due a wage that for what they do, and it should be one that doesn't leave them up at night, worrying about how that's going to work. And so this is a teaching point for the church, capital C church, that should be understood, that we have to take care of our people.
Yeah, so that's a good pivot. So I guess in terms of introduction, the 11-minute introduction here that we've done here, is that this is a real problem. And I know, and listen, I want to be sensitive. There are folks in your church, they're experiencing this same pain too. They haven't gotten, it's not like they've gotten a 17% raise either.
Yeah.
So, right. That's worth noting. At the same time, what can the church do to take care of its staff? And so let's pivot now to talk a little bit about, first, how we should think about it generally from a theological perspective, and then two, what are the kinds of raises that churches should be considering on an ongoing basis, so that you don't get to a point where it's been 4 years and the average salary's only gone up by 0.2% and the overall pay package has actually declined by 2.1%. How can we avoid that in the future? First, on the theological end, AJ, this isn't even in our notes, but it just kind of dawned on me as we were talking, is I believe it's Matthew 25, verse 31, maybe, or verse 7? Maybe, I don't know. Somewhere in Matthew. Jesus.
New Testament. You just keep backing up until you cover everything. Yeah. The New Testament
somewhere
says.
In there. In the New Testament, it says this. Oh, Matthew 7:12. There you go. That's a correct reference here. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And maybe that's just a good starting point for this, is how would you want to be treated? If you were on staff in this church and you were being asked to, be on call all the time, nights, weekends, to pour your life out as a drink offering, to basically have no personal space, and all these things that come along with the job of ministry, the calling of full-time vocational ministry. How would you like to be treated? Would you like to be on top of all of that, be constantly be worried about whether or not you can, buy food? I won't name any names, but I recently worked with a church where the church just dropped the insurance on their staff, didn't let them know in advance, and now they said, hey, you're on your own. That's is that how you would like to be treated in your job? And so, yeah, maybe your job is terrible. I can understand that and empathize, but just because your job's terrible doesn't mean that's how you should treat your pastor. So there's a little bit first of just a do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But there's more than that. So AJ, where else in Scripture do we see this topic addressed?
Yeah, we have 1 Timothy. Paul says that the elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. So that's a fun little tidbit there out of Scripture that pastors like to toss around in conversations every now and then. What exactly Paul means by double honor, I don't know. That certainly is open to interpretation, but all going on and saying, do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. These passages in Scripture don't necessarily, lead us to think, okay, everybody working in ministry takes a vow of poverty. I think it kind of pushes us over more towards like, hey, it's okay to receive compensation for this work. It's reasonable, I think, to not be in a position. It's reasonable to desire to not be in a position to have financial worries, that could affect, how you do your job. This is not marketplace. This is ministry.
Yeah, I think that it's even worth noting too. Like, Paul talks about this. Paul talks about the fact that he didn't ask for anything from the folks when he was there and when he was living among them. He says, I wasn't asking for anything. But he's saying that as an exception, not as the rule. He's like, so that you couldn't say that I was in it for the money, so you couldn't say that I was after my own financial gain. I chose to take nothing from you. And so I think it is, I believe, noteworthy that Paul makes this distinction and says, this isn't how it should be. This is just what I'm choosing to do. Reminds me a little bit of Nehemiah. Nehemiah goes and serves as the governor of Judah, realizes that there's a lot of the history is that there's a lot of leaders taking advantage of their positions and lording it over other people. And he decides to take an extreme opposite way of conducting himself in order to, stand apart and to heal things. And so he feeds actually everyone out of his own pocket and chooses not to take a salary for the time that he serves as governor. But that's intended to be like an extravagant display of radical sacrifice that's not expected of every person or every leader or every circumstance. And so I don't think that you as a pastor have to go, especially when you have a family. Heavens, if you're a single guy and you're a pastor, by all means, which was Paul's situation. Paul was a single guy, so Paul could choose to endure whatever circumstance Paul wanted to. Paul didn't have responsibilities and obligations. You as a pastor, if you've got a wife and you've got kids, I don't think that it's right for you to put them in a position where they're wondering, am I going to have a roof over my head? Am I going to have food to eat? In as much as it's in your power to make sure that those basics are covered for your family, I think you have a responsibility to do so.
If you have a single pastor, maybe pay him a single honor. When he gets married, bump him up to the double honor.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Let me interject this real quick, though, Scott. Let me interject this. So, as far as why we should pay competitive salary, I think we have a biblical basis for financially taking care. But there's a staff retention component to this as well. We are living in what we consider modern times because we're living in them. And so we should be wanting to retain good people. And a lot of that has a financial component to it and a whole benefits package. And, this is very westernized church philosophy.
Yeah. If you're listening to this podcast and you live overseas, you're going, what?
Western. Yeah. That's right. Benefits package. Like, what in the world are you talking about? Your car allowance, your cell phone allowance, your health insurance, all these things. But again, for what extent, good or bad, that marketplace conditions, marketplace philosophies have become integrated into the church in the West, retaining people, retaining good pastoral staff and good administrative staff and others in the church. There's a competitive nature to that with other churches and to some extent into the greater secular marketplace. So that is another reason for having a decent salary and compensating people well, because they may be able to go somewhere else
Yeah.
and feel a greater level of honor for doing the same work.
Yeah, that's a great point. You really want to, I mean, I think it's bad news if you've got a staff person who is trying to float from place to place where he can get a better deal, so to speak, to market his services. I mean, I think that's bad.
For sure.
So I'm not advocating for that at all.
Yeah.
But if you've got someone who does really good work and you'd like to keep him around, and you're paying him $28,000 a year, and he's got a wife and 2 kids, that's not going to work. So he's going to go somewhere where he can make a little bit more money and do right by his family. So we're not advocating here for a pure business mindset on this by any means. At the same time, I don't know. I think it's Matthew 7, right? It's just treat people the way you'd like to be treated. And if someone's doing a good job and you'd like for them to stay and you're vastly underpaying them, then maybe consider giving them a raise. Okay, that's maybe a good spot then to segue to when should we be having these conversations and when should we be bringing them up, as uncomfortable as a conversation as that might be to be having with your board. It is a conversation that you maybe need to have at these critical junctures. So I think we've listed out, AJ, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 different key moments.
Yeah.
Let's walk through them all.
Yeah. And so so hopefully we would love to see by just best practice in staff management that there are at least annual evaluations happening. So this is also a great time to couple that in with financial compensation, even at senior pastor level. I mean, hopefully there's a council or a board or elders or whatever this is, that would be evaluating your senior pastor and talking about this. So that's a great opportunity to be talking about finance. But as far as the first one goes, cost of living raises. That's where we started, introducing today's topic with this consumer price index, being grossly above the level of increase that we've seen in pastors from this SPC study. But cost of living raises. Yeah. I mean, you may not see this every year, but this is something that, those in positions of authority that control finance in the church should be aware of at least every 3 years. More so in times like we've seen recently.
Yeah, I mean, the standard cost of living raise is going to be a baseline. So in most situations, you should get a 2% raise regardless, even of performance. And so, I mean, just think about that for context. So if you were getting a 2% cost of living raise, which is standard, and you'd gotten each of the last 4 years, your salary should have increased 8% from 2018 to 2022. And that doesn't match the 17% inflation that we've seen over that same period of time. But you're at least getting into that territory. And quite frankly, you're at least probably sitting in the same boat that every other American is sitting in. And so the challenges you're facing are then not significantly worse than the challenges that the people in the pews are sitting. And if you've got 0.2% as the raise over that same 4-year time period versus an 8%, which would be where you'd be at if you were just getting a standard cost of living raise. I mean, you're maybe still struggling because everyone is, but you're struggling the same way everyone else is, not struggling way worse than the average person in your church is.
As a best practice for managing staff salaries, cost of living increases every year should be done. Like deferred maintenance on buildings, we see deferred salary increases for cost of living as well. And I think in practice, this works out where every couple of years, they try to catch up. Like, we haven't done any raises in a couple of years. We got to at least catch up on cost of living stuff. Our second one, merit raises. And I mean, personally, I'm a huge fan of merit raises. I think people should be compensated for work well done, and especially above and beyond levels of work. And again, this would be easier to do if you're doing evaluations so that there's documentation about the good, the bad, the ugly of everybody's job performance and how well they're serving the church. But I think merit raises are definitely something that should be included above and beyond a cost of living increase.
For sure. And you know what? A lot of churches, they can't do that. They can't make say a 5% merit raise commitment because they don't want to take on that liability moving forward in perpetuity, right? Which I can understand. They may not have the finances to do that. So you could do that in the form of a one-time bonus and go, you did a really great job this year. And so, you would get that cost of living increase, pay raise, but then also maybe a one-time bonus because you did a great job in the last year. That would be another way to do something that's merit or performance-based.
Yeah. Those bonuses, bonuses can be a bit of a double-edged sword that you have to be careful with. If you begin to make that more of the practice, like let's see how we're looking closer to the end of the fiscal year. We can't do the raise, but we will give you a bonus. And that happens a few years in a row. That begins to become, naturally kind of an expectation. And so if that's not in, part of the employment contract that will happen, but it starts to happen with some regularity and then it stops, we've got tough conversations to have again.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking Jelly of the Month Club. Christmas vacation.
That's right. Christmas vacation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Old Clark Griswold bought that pool because he expected that bonus.
That's right.
Yeah, you're right. You want to be careful with
That's
those.
right. Yeah. Don't put your people in that position. All right. The next one, competitive salary increases. So I spent a little bit of time in local politics, and our city council did a competitive salary study and discovered that much of our city staff was pretty far behind the market, varying by different positions and everything. And so, we began a plan then over several years to increase beyond cost of living, beyond merit raises, to be able to get people's just salaries back up to a competitive point. And so, again, when you defer these kinds of things, when you're not keeping up, then it puts you in a position then of trying to play catch up, which ends up sometimes costing you more, even beyond the finance, more in relationships or lost employees, these kinds of things. But competitive salary increases, and that would, as I said, that would normally happen after doing a salary study to try to figure out, like, how are we doing? What are other churches of our size within, similar geography to be able to match economies? Where are we at, and do we need to begin a plan for that? Sometimes it's not possible to do that in 1 year or even 2 years. It has to be something that, a board or a treasury committee, finance committee would make like a 3 or 4 year plan to increase if you're way behind.
Yep. Yeah, I was asked a year or two ago by a church. This is not something I typically do. Please don't email me and ask me to do this for you, because this is not my normal sphere of work. But I did do a competitive salary study for one or two churches, and kind of laid out what they were paying versus, given their socioeconomic location and roles and hours and all of this. And I think most of their staff, some of their staff, they were like, at 60 or 70% of what the typical salary would have been. Others were a little bit closer. I think one person was half of what his salary would have commanded in the open market. That was a somewhat unique situation, because I think he had other sources of income, so the church could get away with paying him less. At the same time, that does set precedent then for that position. So if he ever leaves, then the church is going to replace his position and really have to struggle in making up that cost. So at any rate, that's not something that we typically do with churches, but you might want to consider working with someone outside, because then it doesn't have to be you who says, wow, you're vastly underpaying the staff person. You can have someone like me who says, hey, you're vastly underpaying the staff person. And then, like you said, AJ actually kind of mapped out, or I think it was over the course of 3 years, what I recommended stepping that up to get it up to the proper competitive salary.
Yeah, well, you bring up a good point, for churches to be careful of, because you can get away sometimes for a while paying somebody less than the position should have. And then when they're gone and you're faced with having to rehire that position, you may not be able to fill that position without then all in one fell swoop increasing the salary. Whereas, if you had made a plan for that and even communicated that well to that employee and they stayed, gotten them up over a couple of years, now you don't have that option anymore. Like, okay, great. We've been getting away with $15,000 a year less than we should have been paying. We can't hire unless we do that now immediately. So
right.
You can paint yourself into a corner by deferring that kind of stuff.
That's right.
All right. Our last one here. Another reason for a salary increase with a position is that they've increased in responsibility. So, gotta love those quote unquote promotions that so many of us have gotten in various positions over the years, in which we gain title and responsibility. But whoopsie, there's no money in there for you on that one. And so, yeah, this is another area that the church just needs to be careful of and compensate people fairly for whatever their new responsibility and position is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's something that churches, if you take the youth pastor and you turn him into the associate pastor and you put a lot on his plate, you can maybe go, oh, maybe we can pay him the same, or maybe we can increase his salary by $5,000. If that same person left, or if you were just from the beginning hiring externally, you immediately would go to the comps. What does this position command? And so if you're looking at, hey, we could just promote internally and get away with $15,000 less. Again, that to me feels a little bit underhanded, and goes back to, is that treating someone the way that you would want to be treated? Are you looking at this as a way to get away with saving a few bucks? We know he'll take on the responsibility, but we won't pay him anymore. That's not a godly way of treating somebody. So I hope we've made it clear here, AJ, that I don't think anyone should be getting into ministry for the money. If you are, that's a mistake. You're unlikely to find that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. At the same time, we don't need to take advantage of people and put them in a position that really hurts their family, and makes it difficult for them to do the job that God has called them to, and to do the job that you want them to do as your pastor or your youth pastor or your whatever the role is. You want the best from them and get the best out of them. And if you want to do that, you really need to treat them in a godly way.
Absolutely. Let's treat people well. Let's give them the honor that they deserve. And let's not avoid these tough conversations. Let's be adults about this. Let's be mature believers about this. And whether the church can afford it or not having the conversation is even worse. So to be honest about financial positions, talk about what we desire, how we want to honor people, and then maybe even enacting a plan for being able to increase money to be able to make that happen. This is stuff that should just be open and talked about. So don't leave these things out there lingering and have that elephant in the room. Thanks for being with us today. This has been episode 156 of the Church Revitalization Podcast, which means today's show notes are at malphursgroup.com/156. This has been very Western church centric and American church centric. However, we know that many of you are listening and watching from all over the world. We're so thankful for you. We love you and your churches. And our desire as a ministry is to give you the greatest support that we can. And that's why, as a nonprofit organization, we do all of the work that we do outside of the United States at no cost to you and your church. For you here in the United States, thank you for supporting that work by all the things that you do in engaging with us to help you in your church. You can know that a portion of that helps your brothers and sisters across the world. And to learn more about that, go over to malphursgroup.com/donate or reach out to me or Scott. We'd love to have a conversation with you about your church helping to support our ministry. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week.